What is the Oxford Group? The largest Brazilian consulting firm in the United States for over 40 years presents Economics and You. A free offering. Ferreira Araújo Law. 3 decades of experience in migration in the United States.
Good evening, gentlemen. We've had some interesting moments here for those who live outside of Brazil or who have businesses outside of Brazil. Often the person, the entrepreneur or the investor doesn't remember, doesn't realize, or doesn't have information about their obligations to the famous Brazilian tax authority. We had the opportunity to invite, we were honored to welcome, as agreed, Vicente Sevilha to share with us his guidance and such useful, so necessary information for those who have businesses here in the United States. Vicente, thank you very much for coming to our program.
I'm the one who should thank you, Dr. Barbieri. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and with the audience that follows you. Thank you.
Vicente, we've seen that many people become deeply concerned and intimidated in the end, especially when they don't know, or at least haven't received any professional, legal, or financial advice about the far-reaching and aggressive reach of the tax authorities that extend well beyond Brazilian borders. And just a few days ago, we saw a series of recent news publications and articles saying that those individuals who have an LLC here in the United States, there are informational and tax obligations, and in Brazil. Can you help us with this information, please?
Of course, absolutely. It will be a pleasure. I think it's worth taking a minute to set up a broader view, a foundation for understanding, because deep down there is a logic to it. It may seem absurd that the Brazilian government wants to know about operations outside Brazil and so on, but there is a logic behind it. So I want to start with this part. I'm even going to make a little joke here. It's a kind of tax romanticism, so we can understand the reasons behind all of this that happens. So there is a concept in international law, and therefore when we talk about international law, we're not talking about Brazilian rules or American rules. We're talking about what is commonly accepted worldwide, which is called universal taxation. So this concept is not one that is set out, period, only in Brazilian law. It is a concept found in international law. We will find similar features in American law, Canadian law, in European countries, in other South American countries, the majority of Western countries, particularly Western countries. All of them have this same rule, which is the concept of universal taxation. And this concept is based on a foundation, on an understanding, which is the use, or rather the enjoyment of public services in the country where I live. So the concept goes like this. I live in a certain country. Each person, and soon I'll make it more complicated, but let's start like this. Each person lives in a certain country, and by living in that country, they make use of public services, whether good or bad. We won't get into that discussion, but they do make use of the public services offered by that country. Therefore, they should contribute with taxes to that country to cover the costs of the services from which they benefit. This is the basic concept. So a person who lives in Brazil pays taxes in Brazil according to this concept. A person who lives in the United States pays taxes in the United States according to this concept. There are exceptions, right? Here, we're having a conversation that I'll call not a course, right? It's a chat, it's an explanation. So I will address the rule instead of the exceptions, but as a rule, each of us lives in one country at a time. So I live in Brazil, someone else lives in the United States, another person might live in Spain, for example, right? So when we look at this, some doubts already start to arise. But wait, I go to the United States a lot, or I go to Spain a lot, or I travel frequently to any other country, and I also spend a lot of time in Brazil. So countries have created rules to define tax residency. It's important to explain that this has nothing to do with citizenship. One thing is separate from the other. Tax residency, as the name itself suggests, is for tax purposes. For example, the Brazilian rule. The Brazilian rule states the following. A person is considered a tax resident in Brazil if they spend more than 183 days per year in the country. So there is a clear Brazilian rule. If I stay in Brazil for more than 183 days per year, I am considered a resident in Brazil. I am required to file an income tax return in Brazil and to pay income tax in Brazil. This is the Brazilian rule, which adapts international law related to universal computation. In the United States, for example, I'm not a specialist, but I know from clients we serve, they use a concept called substantial presence. So they calculate an average. They take the number of days you spend in the United States over 3 years, the previous year, the current year, the most recent years, and one more, and then they calculate a weighted average of that. If this average results in a stay in the United States for more than 183 days, you are considered to be tax domiciled in the United States as well. So the first point is this: I need to understand where my tax domicile is. Some people think that tax domicile is something you choose. For example, Luxembourg has tax advantages. I'm going to change my tax domicile to there. It's not like that. I actually need to move there physically. If I want to have my tax domicile in Luxembourg, at least according to the rule, it says that I have to live in Luxembourg. I'll even share an interesting case here about a client. Wow, she's a woman with a very stable financial situation. And it's true. It sounds like a joke, but it's true. She bought a huge yacht, a big ship. She doesn't have a tax domicile anywhere. She doesn't spend more than a month in any country in the world. So she doesn't meet the tax domicile requirements for any country in the world. It's interesting, she took a different approach. She enjoys the world, so she docks here in Brazil, then soon after goes to Uruguay, then to Argentina, then heads up and keeps traveling the world on her boat. And she doesn't have a tax domicile anywhere in the world. She's an international citizen. Look how interesting that is. But she follows the rule. If she docks in Brazil and stays here for more than 183 days, she has a tax domicile in Brazil. So that's the first part of the introduction. The second part is understanding that in the country where I have tax domicile, I must declare assets and income from all over the world. That's the concept of universal taxation. There are many people who come to me with the following reasoning, which I understand, but which is not correct. I have an LLC in the United States and I have some income from this LLC. Sometimes it owns a property there and so on. And I have my businesses in Brazil. So it's simple. I'll file an income tax return in Brazil with the assets, rights, and income I have in Brazil. And I'll file another income tax return in the United States with the assets, rights, and income I have in the United States. So it's as if the person thinks, for every country in the world where I have investments, I submit a return there telling the story of that country. But the principle of universal taxation says no. When you have tax residency in a country, in that country, you declare income and assets from all over the world. The United States is no different. Anyone who lives in the United States and has income in Brazil must declare to the United States the income they have in Brazil, the assets they have in Brazil, the properties, the dividends they receive, everything they have in Brazil. That's how it works, as I said, because of the issue of universal taxation, which is provided for in international law. So this environment that I have outlined here in broad strokes for our analysis is an environment that says if I have tax residency in Brazil, then in my income tax return, everything I have, for example, in the United States needs to be declared. So if I have a bank account, if I have investments, if I have an LLC, if I have real estate in my name or real estate under an LLC that I own, if I have a private pension plan, if I have shares in American companies, all of that, I need to include all of this in my income tax return. When I mention this, sometimes people react with a look of, I'm not sure if I should use this word, but a sense of injustice. They say, but it's not fair. I already have an operation in the United States. I already have a taxation there in the United States. So let me sum it up here. Countries have some mechanisms to make this fairer. I'll rely on this concept of tax justice. Some mechanisms. One of these mechanisms is international treaties. So Brazil has treaties with about 20 countries. Some countries, actually it's just a few, about 20-something countries. Unfortunately, the United States does not have a treaty with Brazil, or you could say the opposite. Brazil does not have a treaty with the United States. Even so, Brazil and the United States do have a tax agreement. It's a step down. A treaty is broader, while an agreement is less broad, more restrictive. But the agreement between Brazil and the United States does provide for tax offsetting. So when I bring income from the United States into my Brazilian tax return, and the reverse is also true, when I include US income in my Brazilian tax return, I have the right to offset in my return the tax I paid as an individual there in the United States, or here in the United States if you're watching me from the US. So this is not necessarily synonymous with double taxation. It's not. So imagine I have an LLC there. I earned income from the LLC. I paid tax X in the United States. I bring this income into my Brazilian tax return and I report. I have already paid this amount of tax in the United States. What we do here in Brazil is forget about the tax paid in the United States for a minute. Set it aside for now. Would this income in Brazil be taxed at 27.5%? It depends on the income, right? I'm taking the higher bracket as an example. Is it taxed at 27.5%? Yes, it is. So that's the tax owed in Brazil. How much have you already paid in the United States? I've paid this much. If what you paid in the United States is more than what is owed in Brazil, you don't pay anything to Brazil. The tax is considered paid. If what you paid in the United States is less, you pay the difference to Brazil. 99% of the time, the American tax is higher. So even though I report the assets and income on my tax return in Brazil, I don't pay the difference in 99% of cases, because individual taxation in the United States, as I described, is usually higher than in Brazil, and so I offset it. Now, the reverse, just out of curiosity, if I declare in the United States, if my tax residence is there in the United States, I do the same thing. I include my income from Brazil in my American tax return. But I also inform them that I have already paid a certain amount of tax on this income in Brazil. And then I pay the difference to the American government. Let's say I paid 27.5% in Brazil, and in the United States, let's say it's 30%. I pay that additional 2.5% to the American government. There is an analysis that shows there are types of income in Brazil that are traditionally exempt. For example, dividend distributions. Up until last year, they were completely exempt. Until last year, dividend distributions were totally exempt. This created an anomaly because in the United States, they are not. In the United States, there is taxation. So I live in the United States. I have tax residency there. When I report to the American government that I received a certain amount of dividends in Brazil and didn't pay any tax in Brazil, I need to pay American tax. So in that case, I am taxed because I didn't pay anything in Brazil. Now, starting from January 2026, just the day before yesterday, right? Starting from January 2026, when I distribute dividends to someone domiciled in the United States, there will be a 10% tax in Brazil. This 10% tax was created in Brazil. But this doesn't change the tax burden for the American or for someone domiciled in the United States, because they will report, I received this amount of dividends in Brazil. I already paid 10% there. So now I'll just pay the difference to the American government. Anyway, I put together quite a collection here, Dr. Barbieri, to warm up our ears for this topic. And now we can dig deeper wherever this conversation leads.
First question, Vicente. Here we have the so-called IT-in, where a person, when not residing in the United States, obtains a tax number equivalent to a social security number, but they are not considered a tax resident here for any purpose. Theoretically, they are informing the American government that they do not reside here, but want to pay taxes here according to American regulations. In this case, I have a house rented out in the United States, either through an LLC or personally. I pay the tax here based on what I received, if I owe any, and then probably, or in many cases, it ends up being exempt. Regarding this specific income that I have earned, if I already paid it through the IT-in system, or if I simply don't have to pay any more because my personal limit wasn't reached, is this same amount also owed back in Brazil?
This income, if it's under an individual's name, is also taxable here in Brazil. And in this case, since I didn't pay anything in the United States, I only pay taxes to the Brazilian government. That is, if my tax residence is in Brazil, right, Dr. Bobby, just to make it very clear, if I live in the United States and reside there, file my taxes there, and have already officially left Brazil, then I don't pay anything to Brazil. But if I live in Brazil, this excess income, I am taxed here as well, right?
Because this is a topic that leaves a lot of people uncertain with doubts. When I withdraw from Haiti, I'm saying that I'm not a resident, but I want to pay taxes in the United States so I can see. Here, there's that old difference in Brazil where legal entities, except for large corporations, don't pay taxes. So necessarily at the end of the fiscal year, regardless of whether I distribute it or not, as a partner, I am personally liable for the amount based on the revenue that the company had. So looking at this specific amount that he currently owes right here and eventually pays, could you explain exactly how that process is supposed to work? Because it's money I didn't receive that people swear the company didn't pay out, but I paid taxes.
Taxing the individual, choosing to tax the
individual. Can this be offset in Brazil?
So let's set up a scenario. Let's imagine here, I'll use hypothetical numbers. Okay, everyone? So it's just an example. Let's imagine that I have a profit in my LLC of 30,000 Rs. Let's say $30,000, sorry. So I have this profit there in my LLC. And let's imagine that this profit, when I do the calculations, according to the American rules, this would mean paying $5,000 in taxes, just to give a random number. Let's imagine that's the case. So the LLC's profit was $30,000. I am taxed as an individual, and let's imagine that the math says I have to pay $5,000. So I pay those $5,000 to the American government. I go to the Brazilian tax return and say, look, I had a gain of $30,000 in the United States. Then there's a rate. The central bank sets a conversion rate for this money because there was no currency exchange. I didn't bring the money here, so there's a conversion rate called PETAX. Let's imagine it was 5 reais, just to make the math really easy. So on these 30,000 reais, I go to my tax return and say I have foreign income of 150,000 reais coming from profits of this LLC. I enter this information. In another field, I go there and report I've already paid in the United States 25,000 reais, 5,000 reais times 5 reais, 25 reais. So right there, the program will do the calculation. In this particular case for profits, the tax in Brazil would be 15%. So it will do the following calculation. $150,000, I'm even doing the math here, times 15%, that would be 22,500 reais, which I should pay to Brazil. Since I already paid 25,000 reais to the United States, $5,000, I don't have to pay anything in Brazil. I just report these amounts and don't need to pay anything to Brazil because I've already paid more than 22,500 reais. If in this same example, instead of paying 5,000 reais to the United States, I had paid only 2,000 reais, for example, so I made a profit of 30,000 reais, or rather I earned 30,000 reais in profit and paid 2,000 reais. I would have an income of 150,000 reais, which would result in a tax payable in Brazil of 22,500 reais, of which I paid only 10,000 reais in the United States. $2,000 at 5 reais per dollar. I paid only 10,000. So I would have to pay 12,500 to Brazil. The difference I would need to pay to the Brazilian government. I offset what I paid in the United States and pay the remainder. So if I didn't pay anything in the United States, I pay the full 15% in Brazil.
Right. So in other words, either way, the Brazilian tax authority, our dear and beloved Lion, at least has to have the information, at least.
The information, that's it.
And in any case, this is all strictly based on the total amount that was actually received or earned. And here is the big important question we must consider. Was it truly received or was it simply earned, right? In both cases. In Brazil, it's the opposite, meaning if you don't withhold the tax, let's suppose the reverse, I'm a resident citizen of the United States and I received dividends. Those dividends, in my case, up until last year, I didn't pay anything on them. But here in the United States, according to American law, you have to report that the profit of the legal entity in any case is taxable, or in this case, if I didn't receive it in Brazil, it doesn't count.
The rule has changed, right? There's a new law in Brazil that addresses this. I say new because it's recent. The law, I'll mention the number, but it's not important. It's Law 14,754, dated December 29th, 2023. So it's fairly recent. It's a new law. So it established a new rule. So let me explain. Until December 31st, 2023, there was one rule, and starting January 1st, 2024, a different rule began. The rule up until 23 was like this. I only pay tax in Brazil when I actually take the money. If I leave the money inside the LLC or inside my company, I don't pay tax in Brazil. This was in effect until December 31st, 2023. Starting from January 1st, 2024 onward, the rule changed. Now it's like this. I pay tax when I earn the profit, regardless of whether I actually receive the money or not. Even if the money stays in the LLC, I pay the tax even if it remains there. This new rule, I'm not interested in defending anyone. That's not it at all. No, it wasn't even the will of the Brazilian government. This was imposed by the OECD because they want to monitor this profitability, and most countries in the world tax the profit when it is earned, not when it is distributed. Brazil was an exception. It taxed the distributed profit. So under pressure from the OECD, the Brazilian government changed the rule to comply with the OECD standard.
That is absolutely fantastic. This is incredibly valuable and important information because Brazilians living abroad who might not have stayed fully up to date with this rule might still be basing their entire understanding on
I didn't have it.
Under the old law, which has already been changed. I'm going to ask for 15 seconds for our break, but we'll be right back to pick your brain, Vicente.
For over 20 years, the Leaf Ferreira de Araujo office has been providing high-quality, customized services for professionals, entrepreneurs, and investors coming to the United States. It also excellently represents companies employing foreigners on a temporary or permanent. We understand that each client's case is unique and requires a specific approach. We maintain clear and objective communication with the client. Get in touch to find out more. Great Introduce Zone.
Victor. We now return with this tax encyclopedia, which is Dr. Vicente Sevilha. Let's move on a bit with this then. Of these new regulations that we've had recently, that is starting in 2024, we have already discussed this topic in great detail during an earlier episode of our program, specifically regarding the issue of business entities that are established right here in relation to succession, and the critical question of exactly what is going to happen in the future when I eventually leave this legacy within a certain legal entity. Has there been any change to this rule? How are we doing regarding Brazilian citizens and residents who have their financial assets and holdings in Brazil, but those assets are governed and regulated by American legislation when it comes to the legal determination of what exactly will be included in their final estate?
Very good. I'm going to make a little joke here. It's a bit tense, but the topic of inheritance is always heavy, so this lightens it up a bit. Unfortunately, human beings have this terrible habit of dying, right? It's something I don't understand. Why this habit? It's such nonsense. But anyway, when the person is no longer here, then there's this process of division of inheritance. So there are some important considerations for us to look at regarding this topic. The first important consideration is that the analysis of international law also states the following: the asset is divided in the country where the asset is located. So, for example, if I have a company in the United States, that company will be divided according to the local rules, including for tax purposes, inheritance tax, for instance. It will also be subject to inheritance tax according to American law for that company, for example. This is the basic perspective recognized in international law. This still hasn't changed in Brazil. It hasn't changed yet. The Brazilian rule still looks at this and says, assets located abroad are divided according to the foreign rules and are taxed according to the foreign rules. I don't consider this in the Brazilian income tax declaration. So there hasn't been any change regarding this. However, the Brazilian states, I'm referring here to the federative units of Brazil, are interested in charging inheritance tax on assets located outside Brazil. The Supreme Federal Court has already ruled on this issue, stating that they do not have the right to charge it, because there is no supplementary law addressing this issue. A specific law would need to be created, which does not exist. So the Supreme Federal Court has already blocked this. However, Dr. Barbieri, my friends, there is an interest from the Brazilian states in creating a rule to tax inheritance abroad, even though such a rule does not yet exist.
Additionally, regarding the specific case of trusts, so now we are also taxing income generated from trusts in Brazil. Is that in effect, Vicente?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Actually, with trusts, we have two ways. It's very similar to an LLC, but there is a difference. In an LLC, there is a partner. For example, Dr. Barbieri owns an LLC. That's it. He is the one who declares those earnings. With trusts, the Brazilian government allows the income to be attributed either to the founder of the trust or to the beneficiary of the trust. So either one of the two can do it. So, for example, Dr. Barbieri founded the trust and made me the beneficiary. We can agree. Dr. Barbieri can say, I'll let you declare the income. Or Dr. Barbieri can say, no, I'll declare it. One of us declares the income.
And in this case, then you have a law. In other words, if the beneficiary is Brazilian and the founder is Brazilian, you follow the Brazilian rules. It doesn't matter if it's in the United States, if the US doesn't tax trusts, whether during life or after death.
That's right. As far as income tax is concerned, that's how it works. For income tax, we follow the Brazilian rules. For inheritance tax, you follow the rules of the local jurisdiction, where the trust is located. Although there has been this effort that I already described, the Brazilian states want to change this. They want to expand this taxation, but they haven't managed to do so yet.
Right? Taking advantage a bit more of your experience, what new developments did we have last year that are valid for this year? Additionally, regarding the process of reporting to the tax authorities, what about those investors living abroad?
One of the major new developments, which I personally thought would be impossible to happen, was the fluent exchange of information between the Brazilian government and the American government regarding individuals and the investments of individuals abroad. I'm saying that I always thought this would be very difficult because the Brazilian government uses the CPF as taxpayer identification, while the American government doesn't even have this data for most operations in the United States. They don't even have this information, but they manage to organize each other's databases. And today, the Brazilian government already receives from the American government details about what Brazilians own in terms of assets and investments in the United States. And of course, the reverse is also true. The Brazilian government already sends the American government details about what American taxpayers own in terms of assets and investments in Brazil. So there is an exchange, a transparency that is working very well. I don't know if everyone is aware. Here in Brazil, there is the pre-filled income tax return, actually. I'll even explain better what the pre-filled return is. It's like this. Before I submit my income tax return, the government makes available for me to see everything it knows about me. So everything I should include in the return is already there. It takes all the data it already knows from the sources that feed it, fills in the fields of my return, and shows it to me. Look, this is what I already know about you. When I look at the pre-filled return, assets, companies, accounts from the United States already appear pre-filled in my return. The government already brings this information pre-filled in the return. So the Brazilian government already has access to this data, which is strategic and important information. So that's the first aspect. A second important change we notice in this year's income tax return is a different approach to the environment of holdings, including trusts within this context as well. A differentiated look at the environment of holdings, including trusts as part of this environment. Brazilian government is already requesting more detailed information about the succession structure within my planning. So I now have to indicate when it is a holding, when it is an operating company, there is a different organization within the income tax return. And finally, although it's not in the return yet, since January of this year, remittances of dividends abroad have been subject to a 10% tax in Brazil, which did not exist until December. I distribute dividends. Here I'm talking about a transaction. I calculated dividends in Brazil and I'm sending them to the United States. When I send these dividends abroad, there is a 10% tax. So for example, a Brazilian person, even if they're Brazilian, who has residence, so the tax resident in the United States is therefore not a resident in Brazil when her company here in Brazil sends dividends. For her, there is a 10% tax on this remittance, which I'll remind you can be offset in the United States. So I can offset this in the United States as well.
But this is something new that we didn't have before, right, Vicente? That is, income in Brazil for an American person is subject to, let's say, an additional tax, which didn't exist before, but it is offsettable. Is that right?
It is additional and it is offsettable up to a certain point. For individuals, it is fully offsettable. For legal entities, it is not. So for example, if I structured myself, imagine the following scenario. I am domiciled in the United States. I have an American company, and my American company controls a Brazilian company that belongs to me. When this Brazilian company sends dividends to the American company, there is a 10% withholding tax that I cannot take advantage of as an individual.
And when the American company lends money to subsidiaries in Brazil and has to pay interest, is this interest also taxed? Is there any tax on the interest or not?
Yes, there is. This is not something new. It already existed. It has always existed. There is a 15% tax on the payment of interest abroad.
Regardless of the percentage?
Regardless of the percentage, there is a 15% tax on the payment of interest. There are rules. This isn't the case right now, but just to bring it up, there are specific rules when it's from company to company. These are rules that both the United States and Brazil have called transfer pricing. The transfer pricing rules define the limits on the interest I can charge and pay. They specifically address these limits, in fact.
And what about the payment for services? I have a company in the United States that in some way receives, no.
In Brazil?
Right? Not remitting an invoice because the Brazilian company has to pay for this here. This will be recorded as income for the American legal entity or for the individual. But there is also a payment made in Brazil. How is this understood? Under Brazilian law, regardless of whether the person lives in Brazil or not, going back to your initial explanation, I don't benefit from anything Brazil does, but I still owe a tax there regarding what the American company, whether it's mine or not, is going to receive. Is that it?
That's more or less it. I'll give a brief explanation here. This scenario that Dr. Barbieri also described is considered in Brazil as an import of services. So if I hire, for example, Dr. Barbieri through my company here in Brazil, for Dr. Barbieri to do some work for me, when I go to pay him for his work, the Brazilian government says there was an import of services. So I am importing a service. When it's an import of goods, it's very easy to see because the goods arrive through the port or the airport, so I pay taxes on that import. The import is visible. For example, Dr. Barbieri can do the work from the United States and send me, let's say, a report, a contract, or something like that. So he doesn't send it by email, it doesn't go through a port, it doesn't go through an airport. In these cases, the Brazilian government taxes the payment. When I pay for a service abroad, I am taxed on that payment. And it's important to explain, even though people might not like what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's the right thing to do. It's not limited to income tax. So there is income tax on services paid abroad, but there is also PIS on imports, COFINS on imports, and depending on the case, ISS on imports as well. So it's a set of 4 taxes. And to make you even sadder, it can actually reach up to 5 taxes. There's also CID, which is the contribution for intervention in the economic domain. So when I add up these 5 taxes, believe it or not, the import tax on services can reach 47.5% of the service value. So if I have to pay $1,000 to Dr. Barbieri for him to actually receive $1,000 in his bank account here, I pay $1,475. $475 go to taxes and $1,000 go to Dr. Barbieri's account. Then Dr. Barbieri, under American rules, will only be taxed on the $1,000, not the $1,475. Of course, only the income that actually arrives in your account is taxed. And
in this case, logically, this is paid at the time of the remittance, right? Yes, that's it. Let's put it this way. The taxable event happens when the money is sent here, as you explained well. You go to the bank, ask to make this payment, and the bank withholds it at the source. Is that right? Before the remittance.
That would be the correct way. Now, let me give a warning here. Many banks don't do this because they are unaware of the rule, because the bank, in fact, when I go to the bank and make a foreign exchange transfer, a conversion, they focus on the exchange itself, not on the tax rule. So many banks, not knowing the rule, don't withhold the tax. When the bank doesn't withhold it, I have to pay it myself. I need to fill out a payment slip and pay it myself. The bank is not required to withhold the tax. When I hire a specialist, for example, sometimes instead of sending it through the bank, I send it through a brokerage firm, for instance. So brokerages in general, currency exchange brokerages, they know the rules well and handle all the payments. But occasionally the bank doesn't do it. There's another possibility, Dr. Barbieri. You could send me a link and I pay with my credit card. I'll just pay the $1,000 on my credit card. I take the company's corporate card and pay you $1,000 there. So in this case, there was no withholding. I'm required to make the individual payment myself. I fill out separate forms and pay the 475 Rs myself. And
now, in the case of these operations that these shelf banking institutions do, where they merely perform converting one currency into another, is the payment still considered to be legally owed in this particular instance?
if it's an import of services, then yes, it's also owed. For example, if I send money to a bank account of mine where I'm saving money, I'm going to travel, I'm going to the United States, I send money there to use during my trip, there's no taxation at all. We call this a remittance of availability. So there is no taxation whatsoever. If, for example, I'm sending money to pay for my child's school in the United States, I'm not importing the service into Brazil. The service is being provided in the United States, so I don't have to pay any additional taxes. Now, when my company hires someone to provide a service from which I will benefit here in Brazil, I have to pay these import taxes.
Well said. In any case, even if the person pays with a credit card, they are still required to make this declaration.
Thank you. To give you an idea, I'll share a very simple example. Many Brazilian companies hire, can I mention the names of some companies here? Well-known companies. So, for example, I hire a service from Google to store documents. Or do I hire a service from Amazon AWS to store documents? Or I hire software from Oracle, for example, and they charge me from the United States. I register the company's credit card there so that the monthly license fee is charged to the card. So every month, $1,000, $5,000, whatever the amount, is charged to my credit card. These credit card expenses are considered service imports. I need to pay income tax, PIS, COFINS, ISS, and SED on these expenses.
So with your explanation, to clarify even further, in the case where I participate in a trade show, I hire a booth at the trade show, or I hire advertising, whatever it may be, here in the United States, like with Google, etc. In any case where there is a payment for a service, in the broadest sense, the tax is due.
Your question is correct. Both your question and your statement are correct. But as with every rule, there is an exception. It contains an exception, Dr. Bebero, because it says the following. The expenses of Brazilian companies to promote their business abroad are not subject to this taxation. So, for example, if I hire Dr. Barbieri for Dr. Barbieri to organize a business fair for me in the United States so I can sell my products or services in the United States. So this is related to preparation for export, and in this case, there is no taxation.
And the preparation for expansion of the company in the United States, I am hiring a company to provide me with a guidance package, including a fair, but not just a fair, so that I can enter with my products. In the United States, whether it's guava paste or consulting services, how do you classify this? Where would you classify this, Vicente?
So it's an abstract line of reasoning, but it's understandable. It can be explained. If I am going to generate revenue in Brazil from this investment abroad, there is no taxation. Now, if I am generating revenue in the United States, so let's imagine my company is going to open a new company, a subsidiary in the United States. And I am going to generate revenue in the United States. I hire Dr. Barbieri to help me open this subsidiary. I am not going to generate revenue in Brazil, so this payment is subject to tax because I will be generating revenue abroad. When I generate revenue in Brazil from this operation, then I am not subject to taxation.
If this financial investment to broaden its business operations abroad is, to give you a specific example,
Exporting goods, is that right?
exports, even if it's the export of services. And in the case of franchises, does the same idea apply?
Yes, the same idea applies. If I want to expand my franchise network in the United States, I have to think like this. Are these US franchises going to pay the Brazilian unit? If they are going to pay the Brazilian unit, the expense is not subject to taxation. Now, if my Brazilian company is going to create a franchise company in the United States and the franchise units will pay the American unit, then I am subject to these import taxes.
Perfect. And so in this case, just trying to help the Brazilians who are listening to your fantastic explanation, I open a company in the United States, Brazil comes here, opens a company, and this company will carry out activities here. What I send here as capital to develop the company, there is no tax. What I send here for commerce is taxed.
Exactly. An alternative I would have, for example, using your reasoning, let's imagine I want to create a company and I want Oxford's help to do this work. If the Brazilian company hires Oxford, I have import taxes. So what could I do? I create an American company, send money to the American company as an investment, and it pays Oxford. In this case, there is no taxation at all.
Fantastic. I always think we could spend the rest of the year just asking questions. What is your recommendation to Brazilians besides what we always say? Always consult a specialist, right? In this new, let's say, hunger of the taxman. And as you put it very well, it's not a hunger exclusive to the Brazilian taxman. It's an international hunger. No, it's not an exclusive
Only.
Any recommendations?
I think Dr. Barbieri has already given the fundamental recommendation, which is to always have specialists supporting you, not because of the size, regardless of the size of your investment abroad or the profit, the gain you have overseas. It's always good to have specialists advising you so that you don't end up breaking some rule that you might not be aware of. Because international law, I think it's already clear, is not very intuitive. After it's explained, it gets easier, but it's a bit, otherwise unintentionally, you might make mistakes. That would be the first recommendation. The second recommendation I would make is regarding investments, especially for those who want to invest abroad or for those who might be abroad and want to invest in Brazil, is that you should plan ahead. Before making the investment, make a plan. Just a moment ago, I was giving an example where I can hire Dr. Barbieri without paying taxes if I am going to create a subsidiary in the United States. So there are many possibilities that go beyond simply following the rules. Sometimes they lead to a scenario where I comply with the rules, but through paths that also reduce the tax burden, both in Brazil and in the United States. This is possible, which is why it's important to have a specialist, or even more than one specialist, both Brazilian and American.
Wonderful. Dr. Vicente Sevilla, thank you very much. It was a splendid evening in terms of knowledge. And your recommendation is the one we always insist on with our dear listeners. Hire or consult a specialist because it's better to pay.
It's much cheaper
Than a fine, right?
It's significantly more affordable and also considerably safer.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vicente, and thank you to our listeners. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. Once again, we had the presence of this dear friend and great consultant in the tax area, Vicente Sevilla, who has truly shed light on this topic for us. Stay with us. We have good and interesting programs ahead. Have a good night.